The evening wind swept across the plains like a ghost that refused to rest. Dust rose from the dying earth, swirling in the last light of the sun as it sank behind the red cliffs of the western ridge. The ranch at the edge of the world stood silent, a weathered cabin, a broken corral, a lone mare grazing where the barn used to be. The ashes of that barn, burned down 2 years ago, still stained the ground black. Each gust carried their scent, the faint trace of smoke that time had never managed to erase. Mary Calhoun stood on her porch, her hands resting on the railing worn smooth by decades of storms. She was 43, though the lines on her face told of 50 years of hardship. Her hair, once the color of autumn wheat, had gone pale at the roots, streaked by grief more than age. Her eyes, cold gray, like the steel of her rifle, searched the horizon the way others might look for God. The world had shrunk around her since that night, where laughter used to echo through the house. Her husband's deep chuckle, the gentle bray of the mule, the clatter of boots on wooden floors. There was now only silence. Silence, and the whisper of wind against her windows. Behind the cabin, 3 graves sat in a neat row. Her husband, Daniel Calhoun, her boy, Thomas, and the neighbor who tried to help them that night. She visited those graves each dawn and dusk, sometimes talking softly as if they could still hear her. The townsfolk said she'd gone mad doing it, that she was talking to ghosts. Maybe they were right. Maybe ghosts were all she had left to talk to. Red Rock was 15 miles south, a small dust-choked town where even hope seemed to limp when it passed through. The townsfolk still spoke of the Butcher Gang in hushed tones. 6 men led by Harlan Pike, a brute with a silver tooth and a heart like dry tinder. They had burned her barn, stolen her cattle, and shot Daniel when he tried to stop them. No one in town lifted a finger after. The sheriff claimed they were too many. The preacher said revenge belonged to God. But Mary had stopped believing God was watching the plains. Every evening, as the sun bled into the mesas, she would clean her Winchester rifle, the one Daniel left hanging above the mantel. Her hands moved with ritual precision, oiling the barrel, checking the sights. It wasn't madness. It was memory. The rifle was part of her, the last thread tying her to the life that had been stolen. Sometimes, when thunder rolled in from the north, she'd step out to the porch and watch the dark clouds crawl across the sky. The lightning would flash, and for an instant she'd see the reflection of her husband's face in the window, just long enough to make her heart break again. Then the rain would fall, and she'd whisper into the wind, "I'm still here, Daniel. Still keeping the line." On the night they came back, the sky was split by a storm brewing over the distant ridge. The air felt heavy, too still, too quiet, like the earth itself was holding its breath. The mare in the corral grew restless, stomping at the dirt. Mary felt it too, that strange electric stillness before something terrible breaks loose. Then, faintly, she heard it. Hooves. At first it was a soft rhythm lost in the wind, then louder, 6 horses, maybe 7, coming from the North Trail. The Butcher Gang rode with no care for silence, their laughter rolling across the plains like thunder before the storm. Mary didn't move at first. She simply stood there, her breath steady, her hand gripping the railing. She had imagined this moment 100 times in her sleepless nights. Now that it was here, she felt no fear, only clarity, like a clock striking the final hour. She stepped inside the cabin. The old floorboards creaked beneath her boots. The rifle hung in its usual place above the mantel. She took it down, checked the chamber, loaded. Her hands didn't tremble. She lit the lantern on the table, though she didn't need the light. She already knew what she was about to do. Outside, the laughter grew louder. Shadows on horseback appeared over the hill, silhouettes black against the lightning. The men rode hard, drunk on whiskey and cruelty. They shouted to one another, boasting about some raid they'd pulled near Dry Creek. One of them, a lanky man with a red scarf, swung a bottle in the air and fired his revolver at the sky. The thunder answered back. "Look there!" one of them yelled. "The widow's still breathing." Another laughed. "Guess we didn't burn her stubborn hide deep enough last time." Mary stepped onto the porch, the lantern's glow framing her in the storm's half-light. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Her rifle was already raised, barrel steady. Harlan Pike reined in his horse, grinning down at her. "Evening, Miss Calhoun. You looking to join your man tonight?" She leveled the rifle. The lightning flashed white across the plains, reflecting in her eyes. "I told you," she said, her voice low, calm as the grave, "not to come back here." Before the last word left her lips, the rifle cracked. The bullet sliced through the storm and clipped Pike's hat clean off his head. It spun into the mud, and the men froze for a heartbeat, then burst into drunken laughter. Hellfire! The widow still got aim. One of them cackled. "Careful, boys. She might shoot the breeze next." But Pike's grin was tight. He picked up his hat from the mud, brushing the rain from its brim. "You best keep that gun pointed low, lady," he said, "or we'll finish what we started." Mary didn't answer. The storm was gathering its voice now, the thunder closer, the wind howling through the grass. She stood there unmoving, a lone figure against the fury of the sky. Something in her calm made the men uneasy. They laughed again, but the sound rang hollow. When Pike turned his horse to leave, she lowered the rifle, but her eyes followed them until the darkness swallowed their shapes. Only then did she step back inside, her pulse steady as ever. She set the rifle on the table and took out a small box from the drawer. Inside, a dozen bullets gleamed faintly in the lamplight. She ran her finger across them, whispering softly, names only she could hear. By the time the thunder broke, the plains were drenched in rain. The butcher gang's laughter had vanished into the night, carried away by the storm. But the sound of that single shot still lingered, echoing across the valley like a promise made in blood. In the morning, Red Rock would wake to stories again. Some would say the widow fired warning shots at ghosts. Others would say she lost her mind to grief. But the old men at the saloon, those who remembered the border wars, would only nod and mutter, "A Calhoun don't miss." And out there, on the edge of the frontier, where the wind never stopped blowing and the earth still smelled of smoke, Mary Calhoun sat alone in her quiet house, staring at the rifle on her table. Lightning flashed across the plains again, and for a heartbeat the light caught her face. No fear, no sorrow, just the cold certainty of a woman who knew the storm had only begun. She turned toward the window, where the grave stood faintly visible through the rain. Her lips moved, a whisper too soft for the world to hear. "Next time they come, Daniel," she said, "I won't miss their hearts." Then she blew out the lantern, and darkness reclaimed the widow's ranch. Outside, the rain kept falling, washing the ashes of serenity deeper into the soil, as if the land itself was bracing for what it knew would come. The sun bled out slowly behind the jagged ridges of red rock, painting the sky in strokes of dying fire. Shadows stretched long and thin over the plains, swallowing the land in creeping dusk. The town below slipped into its usual uneasy quiet, the kind that follows fear, not peace. Lamps were lit, doors bolted, shutters drawn. No one wanted to see the butcher gang ride through again. Up on the northern edge, where the land rose and flattened into endless fields of yellow grass, Mary Calhoun's cabin stood against the twilight like a scar that refused to fade. The wind had started to change, colder now, with a taste of iron and rain. She could feel it in her bones, that familiar shiver of warning that whispered, "Something wicked draws near." Inside, the single lantern cast a weak circle of light across the room. Dust floated in it like drifting souls. Mary sat at the kitchen table, her Winchester laid before her, disassembled piece by piece. The motion of her hands was deliberate, almost reverent. She had done this so many times it had become a kind of prayer. The smell of gun oil mingled with the faint scent of sage. She burned near the window. Outside, coyotes called to one another from the hills. She didn't flinch, didn't even look up. The world outside no longer belonged to her. It had been taken. But this table, this rifle, these bullets, these were hers. The door creaked under the pressure of the wind. For a brief moment, it sounded like Daniel's boots crossing the porch, like the life that once filled this home. Her hand paused, hovering above the rifle's receiver. Then she caught herself, drew a slow breath, and began again. Every part of the gun gleamed clean in the lamplight, the same rifle that once hung proudly above the mantel, and used, a symbol of peace. Daniel had laughed when he gave it to her after the wedding. "In case I forget how to shoot straight," he'd said, winking. She had promised then never to touch it again. But promises meant nothing after the fire. From the cupboard, she drew a small wooden box. The lid bore the faint initials DC, Daniel Calhoun. Inside lay 12 polished brass bullets. She had made them herself, melted and poured over the months after his death, cast with the steady patience of grief. Her fingers brushed each one as if they were rosary beads. She took one between her thumb and forefinger and whispered softly, "For you." Her voice barely rose above the sigh of the wind. The bullet clicked into the chamber. Then another. "For Thomas." Her boy's face flickered in her memory, bright eyes, freckles, a grin missing 2 teeth. The laughter that used to fill this house now echoed like ghosts in her skull. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath. "For the man who laughed at his grave," she said. Another click. She didn't cry. Not anymore. Grief had burned itself dry long ago. What was left was colder, quieter, a hollow kind of purpose that neither sleep nor prayer could touch. The storm outside thickened. Lightning flashed on the horizon, a silent, blue-white flicker that outlined the hills and fences for a heartbeat before swallowing them again. In town, the church bell rang faintly, though no one was calling for service. It was a warning, the same one they always gave when strangers were spotted on the ridge. She stood and crossed to the window. From her vantage, she could see the faint orange glow far off in the distance, a campfire. Too many lanterns clustered too close together. No traveler needed that much light. She knew the look of a camp built for comfort, and the look of one meant to taunt. "They're here," she murmured. The sheriff had visited earlier that morning, riding slow and uneasy, hat twisting in his hands. He'd told her to stay inside, that stirring up trouble would only get her killed. His eyes darted everywhere but hers. "Ain't worth it, Mary," he'd said. "Those men ain't right in the head. Best thing you can do is let the Lord judge 'em." She had smiled, small and tight. "The Lord had his chance," she'd said, and closed the door. Now, as thunder rolled like drums across the valley, she realized the sheriff was probably sitting behind his desk in town, pretending not to hear the wind. The law had its limits. So did Mercy. She poured a little whiskey into a chipped glass and sat back down. The drink bit her tongue, warm and bitter. She stared at the rifle. The metal gleamed under the lantern light, cold and perfect. A weapon made for one thing, ending something that shouldn't go on. Her gaze drifted to the wall, where an old framed photograph hung. Her and Daniel standing side by side, younger, laughing, the ranch behind them full of promise. The world had been golden then. She had been Mary Finch, daughter of a frontier marksman, able to shoot a hawk's eye at 50 yards. Her father had taught her that the rifle was not just a weapon, but a measure of discipline and soul. She had given up that life for peace. When she met Daniel, she'd promised herself never to raise a gun again. The war in Texas had left too much death in her hands. She wanted to live soft, to plant things, to build. But fire changes everything. She could still smell that night when she closed her eyes. The sharp sting of kerosene, the crack of gunfire, the scream of her boy as she dragged him from the flames. The butcher gang's laughter echoing in the dark. Daniel's voice fading into the smoke. "Run, Mary." And she had, with her son limp in her arms, half-burned and barely breathing. He died before morning. Now, each bullet she touched carried the weight of that night. Each name whispered into its brass shell was a fragment of the past she meant to bury, one trigger pull at a time. She loaded another bullet. "For the one who burned my crops." The rain began to fall, tapping against the window in a slow rhythm. The lantern flickered, throwing long shadows across the room. Mary stood, moving toward the door, and opened it just enough to feel the wind whip through her hair. The smell of rain-soaked earth filled her lungs. Somewhere far away, a horse neighed, restless and uneasy. Her mare stood by the fence, ears twitching, sensing what was coming. Animals always knew before people did. Mary stepped out onto the porch, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other. The night air pressed cold against her face. She stared toward the distant lights, small flames, flickering like eyes in the dark. The butcher gang was camped less than a mile from her land now. Close enough to see her chimney smoke, close enough to smell the fear they thought she carried. But fear had died the same day her husband did. She set the lantern down on the porch railing and raised her rifle, looking through the scope, though she couldn't truly see that far in the rain. It wasn't about aim tonight. It was about intent. The first bullet she would fire when the time came already had its name carved in her mind. Harlan Pike. Lightning split the sky, blinding white. For an instant, the plains were laid bare before her, the grass slick and glinting, the horizon alive with flame-colored clouds. Then the darkness fell back like a curtain. Mary lowered the rifle and exhaled. Her breath came out slow, steady, visible in the cold. "You'll come back for me," she said softly. "And when you do, I'll be ready." Inside, the clock ticked faintly, the only sound in the world besides the rain. She sat again, poured another measure of whiskey, and stared at the fire burning low in the hearth. It crackled and sighed, as if remembering its wilder cousin that had once devoured her life. Dawn crawled over the plains like a wounded beast, slow, raw, and red. The first light of morning spread across Red Rock, revealing dust hanging thick as fog and a silence heavy enough to crush prayer. The town was waiting. Everyone felt it. The air was too still, the sky too bruised. Something was coming. From the northern ridge, the butcher gang rode in, laughing like devils on Judgment Day. Their horses kicked up clouds of pale sand as they thundered through the main street. Bottles swung from their saddles, pistols gleamed in the rising light. Harlan Pike rode at the head, his silver tooth flashing each time he grinned. The few souls who dared to be awake scattered into doorways. The blacksmith closed his forge. The preacher shut the church doors. Even the sheriff, standing outside his office, froze when Pike's horse stopped in front of him. "Mornin', Sheriff," Pike drawled, tipping his hat. "Heard the town's been sleeping too sound. Thought we'd wake it up." His men hooped and hollered, firing into the air. One bullet shattered a saloon window, another ricocheted off the bell tower. The sheriff tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. Pike chuckled, then tossed him a whiskey bottle. It shattered at the lawman's feet. "Pick that up, lawman," Pike said. "You look thirsty." No one moved. The sheriff's hand hovered near his holster, then fell limp. Pike laughed again and spurred his horse forward. The gang rode toward the saloon, kicking over barrels and knocking down signs. That's when the wind shifted. A single rider appeared on the southern road, a black silhouette against the pale horizon. Mary Calhoun rode slow, steady, the hooves of her mare thudding like a funeral march. She wore Daniel's old duster, black as coal, frayed at the hem. Her rifle hung across her back, gleaming in the new sun. The townsfolk peered through cracks in their windows, whispering her name like it was a ghost story come true. She didn't look at them. Her eyes stayed fixed on the saloon. By the time she reached the hitching post, Pike and his men were already inside, laughing loud enough to drown out the storm that brewed in her chest. She dismounted, tied her horse, and adjusted the brim of her hat. Her boots clicked softly against the boards as she climbed the saloon steps. The swinging doors creaked open. Inside, the air reeked of whiskey and sweat. 6 men crowded around a table, cards and bottles strewn between them. Pike sat at the center, boots up, his revolver resting easy on the table. He looked up when she stepped in. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, grin spreading slow. "If it ain't the ghost herself." Mary didn't answer. She walked to the bar, poured herself a glass of whiskey, and set it down untouched. The barkeep, an old man with trembling hands, backed away, eyes darting between her and the gang. "You've got some grit showing your face here," Pike said. "Didn't you learn last time we don't leave jobs half done?" Mary turned to face him, calm as dawn. "You left one thing undone," she said. "You left me breathing." The laughter died. Pike stared at her for a heartbeat, then pushed back his chair. "You got guts, lady. I'll give you that. But I ain't here to play." Mary's hand slid behind her coat. "Neither am I." The sound of the rifle echoed like thunder. Pike's glass exploded in his hand. For one stunned moment, the saloon froze. Then chaos erupted. Gunfire filled the room, sharp and deafening. Mary moved like the wind, No wasted motion, no hesitation. Every shot she fired was precise, each one a reckoning. A man reached for his pistol near the piano. Her bullet struck him square between the eyes. Another tried to duck behind the bar. She shot through the bottle he hid behind, shattering glass and skull in the same breath. The townsfolk outside heard the eruption and ran for cover. But through the gun smoke, one thing became clear: Mary Calhoun wasn't missing. When the last echo faded, only 2 men were left alive: Pike and a nervous kid no older than 20. The boy dropped his gun and ran out the back door, screaming. Pike stood breathing hard, his revolver drawn, his grin gone. "You think you're justice, woman?" he snarled. Mary stepped closer, smoke still curling from the barrel of her rifle. "No," she said. "Just memory." Pike fired first. The bullet tore through her coat, grazing her side. She didn't flinch. Her reply came a heartbeat later. One clean shot that shattered his shoulder and sent him crashing through the saloon doors into the dusty street. She followed him outside. The town was silent now. The sheriff stood frozen, hand hovering over his holster, but not daring to move. The sky had turned white with dust. The sun burned through it like a wound. Pike crawled backward, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He spat blood into the dirt, laughing through the pain. "You think you've won," he rasped. "You ain't done yet, widow." He staggered to his feet, stumbled toward his horse, and mounted with a wild burst of strength. Then he rode north, toward the canyon. Mary watched him go. Then she swung into her saddle and followed. The chase tore across the plains, through sagebrush and dry creek beds, the wind roaring in her ears. Pike rode hard, his trail of blood marking the sand. The canyon walls rose ahead, tall, red, ancient, as if carved to witness what was coming. By the time he reached the rim, his horse was lathered, his breath ragged. He dismounted, turning to aim his revolver. Mary slowed her mare, stopping 20 paces away. The wind whipped her coat around her like wings of morning. Pike's hand trembled. "You could have stayed quiet," he said. "Could have lived your days out on that dead ranch. But you had to come for me." "I didn't come for you," she said softly, stepping closer. "I came for them." He sneered. "You think you're some avenging angel?" Her voice was steady as stone. "No, just a widow who remembers." The world held its breath. The wind died. The sky above them turned still and hollow. Pike fired first, wild, desperate. The shot went wide, hitting stone. Mary didn't hesitate. Her rifle barked once, a single, perfect sound that rolled through the canyon like thunder. Pike staggered back, a red bloom spreading over his chest. His revolver fell from his hand, clattering to the rocks. He looked down, eyes wide with disbelief, as if the bullet itself had carried every name he'd ever wronged. Mary approached slowly, her rifle lowering. He dropped to his knees, gasping. You'll hang for this," he wheezed. She looked past him to the horizon, where the sun had just cleared the cliffs. "No," she said. "You already did." He fell forward, face first into the dust. The echo of the shot lingered, trapped between the canyon walls, fading like a memory that refused to die. Mary stood over him for a long time. The wind returned, carrying the scent of sage and gunpowder. She reached into her pocket and took out a single brass casing, engraved faintly with a name, Harlan Pike. She placed it on the ground beside him. The canyon swallowed the silence that followed. When she rode back to town, the people of Red Rock were waiting. No one spoke. They watched her pass, their faces a mix of awe and fear, as if witnessing something both holy and terrible. Her duster was torn, her hat shadowed her eyes, and the rifle across her lap still smoked faintly in the morning air. The sheriff stepped forward, his voice trembling. "It's done, then." A week passed before the wind carried the scent of peace back to Red Rock. The sky had softened to a pale blue again, and the dust finally settled over the streets that once echoed with gunfire. Travelers riding in from the east found the canyon quiet, too quiet, and the earth there freshly turned. 7 mounds of soil, each marked with a single brass casing, gleamed faintly under the morning light. No preacher stood over them, no cross, no ceremony. Justice had already been said in a language the West understood best, lead and silence. In town, The sheriff couldn't bring himself to look at the canyon. He'd ordered the men to bury the gang, but hadn't stayed to see it done. When he returned, he sat in his office for hours, staring at the 10-star pinned to his vest, the badge that had lost all its shine. He finally took it off and set it on his desk beside a half-drunk bottle of whiskey. The next morning, the townsfolk found a note on the door, short, almost shameful. The law failed before she did. He left town that same day, never to return. Mary Calhoun's cabin stood silent at the edge of the plains. The smoke from its chimney had long gone out. The mare she rode into town on was gone too, tracks leading eastward before fading into the dry grass. Some said she rode toward the river, where Daniel was buried. Others whispered she went farther, to the far plains beyond the canyons, chasing the horizon like a spirit that couldn't rest. No one saw her again, but at night, when the wind came down from the ridges, the coyotes' cries sometimes carried a sound like the click of a rifle bolt sliding home. The townsfolk, once too fearful to speak her name, now did so with reverence. They cleaned the saloon, patched the holes in the walls, and spoke quietly of the morning the widow had walked through death and come back with the dawn. The blacksmith offered to keep her rifle safe, but it was the schoolteacher who insisted it belonged to everyone. So the sheriff's office, empty now, became a small hall of remembrance. There, on the wall above the desk, hung her Winchester, polished and shining as though untouched by time. Beneath it, a single plate of iron was engraved with words that no one dared forget. Every bullet had a name. Children would stop on their way home from lessons, staring up at it through the dusty window. They'd ask their parents if it was true, that a woman had done what no posse dared, that she'd ridden alone into the jaws of hell and pulled justice out by the roots. The parents would only nod, their eyes distant, because they too had seen it. The way she'd moved through smoke and thunder, calm as a prayer and cold as vengeance. Years bled into one another. Red Rock grew smaller. The railway came, bypassing the town by a few miles, and new names replaced old ones. The saloon changed hands 3 times. The preacher grew old and bent, but every so often, when the nights turned long and the whiskey burned slow, someone would tell her story again. It usually began the same way. There was a widow once, they'd say, who lost everything to a pack of devils, and when the law had its face, she picked up her husband's gun and gave the devil his due. The details shifted with time. Some swore she'd killed 20 men, not 7. Others claimed her bullets never missed, because she prayed over each one. A few said she was a ghost, not flesh and blood at all, just the spirit of justice wearing a woman's face. But all of them agreed on one thing: she never flinched. Around campfires from Arizona to Wyoming, her tale grew taller than the mesas. Cowboys who'd never seen Red Rock spoke of her as if they had ridden beside her. They said she rode with her hair unbound, coat billowing like wings, her eyes gray as the storm. They said when she fired, lightning cracked, and when she left, even the coyotes bowed their heads. Some nights, the story came softer, told by old-timers who had once seen her up close. They'd lean forward, the firelight flickering in their eyes, and their voices would drop to a whisper. She didn't ride for glory, they'd say. She rode for memory. Time wore away at Red Rock, until only a few stubborn souls remained. The buildings leaned, the windows cracked, but her rifle still hung above the sheriff's desk. The brass casing below it had dulled, the engraving half faded, but the words were still legible enough to haunt anyone who read them. Then, one spring morning, a traveler came, a young writer from back east with a notebook full of questions. He'd heard the story in a saloon 3 towns over and came looking for truth. He found an old man sitting outside the general store, rocking slow in the sun. The writer asked if he'd known her, the widow of Red Rock. The old man chuckled, a dry sound like wind in dead grass. "Known her," he said. "Son, no one knew her. We just saw what she became." He pointed toward the canyon in the distance, where the land blushed red under the morning light. "They're still out there," he said. "Those men she put down. Ground took M, but it remembers. Every time the wind passes through those rocks, you can hear her shot again, clean and final, like the world itself blinked." The writer stayed the night at the inn, though it was barely more than a roof and 4 walls, and wrote by lamplight until dawn. His story would appear years later in some dime novel, wrapped in myth and printed in gold ink. It sold well enough, but it never caught what really happened. Words never could. The truth lived in smaller moments, the quiet before the shot, the whisper of a name breathed into a bullet, the look in a widow's eyes when she decided she'd rather die fighting than live forgotten. Those who'd been there carried that look with them forever. By the time the century turned, Red Rock was little more than a memory. The saloon caved in after a storm, the church bell cracked, and the last of the old graves sank into the grass. But travelers still came sometimes, drawn by the story, by the legend. They'd ride out to the canyon, find those 7 unmarked mounds, and fall silent. And if they looked close enough, they'd find a glint of brass buried in the soil. On nights when the wind rose high and the stars burned low, the desert would hum with that strange, hollow tune, the echo of something that refused to die. Some said it was the wind through the rock. Others swore it was a woman's voice, steady and calm, whispering the names of the dead. They called her many things over the years. The widow marksman, the ghost of Red Rock, the angel with the rifle. But in the end, none of those names fit quite right. Because what she'd done wasn't about vengeance or fame. It was about balance, about a world that had taken everything from her, and a woman who dared to take something back. And so the legend stayed alive, not because of what she killed, but because of what she proved. That even in a land ruled by violence, justice could still wear the face of a woman who'd buried her heart and refused to stay down. Long after the last fires died and the West turned to history, the story still found its way into mouths and memories. Travelers would stop in lonely taverns, share whiskey, and say, "You ever hear about the widow of Red Rock?" And somewhere beyond the edge of that conversation, the plains would hold their breath, as if listening too. Because legends don't end. They wait. And when the storyteller paused, staring into the fire, the final words would always come the same, soft as prayer, certain as thunder. They laughed at her warning shot. But the West never laughed again.